Okay, I think we're running late, so let's get this session started. So, good morning and welcome to everybody. Our first speaker is Kurt Maree. Kurt Maree is a lecturer at our Department of Logistics in Stellenbosch. He lectures operations research and business analytics, and he's currently enrolled for his PhD. Is the topic that you see on the board there, and his research interest is the distribution of what's the Africa English word now? The distribution of information on the internet via social media mainly. That's kind of like where his interest lies in terms of research interest. But today he's going to speak about towards the infodemiological analysis of social media and mental health. Thank you, Kurt. We hold your presentation.
Thank you, Stefan. I just want to say, don't worry about the empty chairs. The overflow venue, lecture hall 6, is completely full. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being at my presentation. I appreciate it greatly, and hopefully through the course of this presentation, I can enlighten you, show you the exciting parts of my research that I'm sort of passionate and keen to get started on. A couple of, I don't want to say warnings, but there are a couple of sort of things that I need to say ahead of time. There is a trigger warning. I do talk about depression and suicidal ideation in this. I also want to say that if you get tired and you want to know when the end of my presentation is, I have hidden a green ribbon like this somewhere in the presentation. If you find it, you know that I'm towards the end, so keep an eye on it. I made it very difficult to find. But hopefully it's going to be exciting nonetheless. This research is working towards my PhD, which is a collaboration between Stellenbosch University with my supervisors, Dr. Leishan Venter and Professor Stefan Pasaki, and also Dr. Stephanie Merchant from the University of Bath, who is from the Department of Health at the University of Bath, at the Center for Qualitative Research. And so this amalgamation of cool research topics is going to be very exciting and sort of quite a difficult task that lies ahead. So I'm quite excited for it, and I hope you enjoy it. Right, so I'm going to start off with the biggest picture that I could probably give, and that is probably painting the world. What does the world look like at the moment? According to the Data report from 2022, July this year, they estimate that there's about 7.98 billion people in the world this year, estimated to be 8 billion by November of this year. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. Of those 7.98 billion people, 5.03 billion people are said to have access to the internet. And with that access to the internet, there comes a lot of data that's being generated and a lot of information that can be gleaned from that data. So according to a Seagate report in 2018, they mentioned that it is expected to be 175 zettabytes worth of data in the data sphere by the year 2025. What does that mean? 1 zettabyte is 1 billion terabytes. And the world was said to have passed its first zettabyte in 2012. So just the amount of data that's being generated means that there's so much more information to be gleaned from that. And I think it was Rupert yesterday that mentioned in his presentation that information is both relationships and data. And so this is sort of what this research wants to touch on by looking at that relationship and the data itself. Right. So with that, data and that information, it makes it kind of difficult to sort out what is important information, what is misinformation or disinformation, and that is what this term infodemiology refers to. It is a portmanteau between the word information and epidemiology. So it gives you a rough idea of sort of what we can look at. Like epidemics spread through networks and diseases can spread through those networks, so too can information spread and make it very difficult for us to find solutions to problems related to public health. So just to give you a sense of how important this is, in 2020, February 2020, the World Health Organization Director General said the following quote: "We're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic." And I don't know if you guys need to be reminded about what happened in 2020, but if somebody's talking about an infodemic in 2020, then you know it's that it's something to turn our attention to. Right? And as epidemiologists have built a toolbox for the things that they need in order to fight epidemics, so too does this field of infodemiology need tools to combat all of this information that comes our way, and sort of makes it difficult for us to get to the root of the problem. So just a little bit of background of the kinds of research that infodemiology does touch on. It is looking at internet, specifically the information on the internet, and how that informs the spread of diseases themselves, specifically influenzas and many other contagious diseases. So it would look at internet search histories, post on social media, and use that as a proxy to determine how the spread of influenzas and diseases spread as well. And with that, I think there's a big part in infodemiology that looks at public health, but there's a part of public health that I think we often overlook, and that is when it comes to mental health. With these, if I can say this term, unprecedented times, I think everybody has been very much focused on the fact that mental health is on the forefront and quite an important topic to talk about. According to the Global World Index, they are a public survey that they do regarding internet information. They mentioned in their Collecting the Dots report in the end of 2021 that 31% of internet users say that they turn to social media when it comes to their well-being, which is kind of an important thing to note. This fact that a lot of people say that social media may be a negative thing, also know and have an idea that it can have a positive impact on people's well-being. To that end, when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, within the goal of good health and well-being, there is a specific target that mentions sort of towards the end that they want to promote mental health and well-being. I, for one, believe that if these goals were drafted a little bit later on, that would have way more of a focus and be its own sort of target goal. And I think that's a part of infodemiology and sort of just the spread of information through networks that is often overlooked at when it comes to public health. So with that information, with that background in mind, I want to take us through this journey. So indulge me, if you will, as we go along this journey about where we have been with this research, where we currently stand and where the gaps may be within this research, and then ultimately where we see ourselves going with this. So what I find quite interesting and fascinating about this research as well is that it gives an opportunity for people to share their stories. And so you'll see a lot of my contact details at the bottom so that you can follow along my PhD journey and also share your stories, because I feel that it informs the way that we destigmatize mental illnesses as well. So please do contact me if you do see those details. A little bit of a shameless plug over there. All right. So let's talk about where we've been. Where do we find ourselves? And I think it's important to look at what psychologists say the effects of social media has on one's mental health and well-being. This is a graphic from The Economist, taken from the Royal Society of Public Health, where they spoke to 14 to 24-year-olds about the impact that social media sites, specific platforms, have on a lot of psychosocial, social, physiological, and emotional aspects of well-being, right? So these are the 4 platforms: Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, and Twitter. And they've listed things like sleep, anxiety, community building, and they were asked to say what the impact these platforms had on these different aspects of their well-being. So a dark red means that there's a negative impact that social media use has and that specific platform has on their well-being, versus something quite dark blue, which represents quite a positive impact. And again, it shows that dichotomy of how there's an opportunity to sort of harness the power of social media in that regard, that it's not all bad, and that there is an opportunity for there to be good, right? So that's what psychologists say. And to summarize some of the aspects that they mention, they talk a lot about social comparison. That is the fact that you compare yourself to someone else on social media, a fear of missing out, cyberbullying, sleep deprivation, isolation, depression, and anxiety. And sort of the crux of what gives the research the legs that it has is emotional contagion. The fact that I don't know if you've all experienced the fact that if someone says something quite negative, it can sort of affect your mood as well. Same with something positive. So emotional contagion is that phenomenon that it can exist in social networks. That spread of mood, if I can call it that, is a perfect place to start and to take this research a little bit further. Then we move a little bit away from the psychology and see the research with the social sciences and the computer sciences and scientists, and see what they've done a little bit. A big part of social media and mental health research has been looking at the words that people use on social media, the language that they use. And so a lot of research has been looking at linguistic markers, the use of specific words to indicate whether someone is more or less at risk of certain mental illnesses. And that's sort of a big part of the research is looking at the language. Another part of the research looks a lot at trying to predict the likelihood of someone being at risk of quite harmful behaviors like suicide through the use of trying to develop classifiers, looking at computer vision techniques to try and see how people's visual posts can be an indication that they might be more or less prone to sort of being at risk of these mental unwell-beings. And also trying to sort of predict just mental health in general. And there's a danger behind that because a lot of the times this research can be done in a silo without there being a mental health practitioner on board. But I can say that from all the studies that I've read so far, there has been consultation with mental health practitioners. So there is an awareness that this research can be dangerous and needs to be used in conjunction with people who are actually working with mental illnesses. Then we look at studies that are that are very infodemiological, the actual spread of information. So this study in particular, quite a fascinating study, actually looks at the spread of information as it pertains to Twitter and seeing if somebody with a sickness meets up with this person in terms of their location on social media, they can use that as a proxy for the spread of a disease as well. So if I see that this person has met up with this person and moved and met up with this person on social media, and I know one of them has a sickness, I can use that as an indication that they are spreading the flu as well, which is quite a fascinating study. And then lastly, I think sort of a big thing when it comes to looking at language and the language that we use when we talk about mental illnesses on social media is the fact that what is sarcastic? What is somebody just contributing to the conversation versus what is somebody who has an issue and who needs help and who is sharing their story? How does one separate the wheat from the chaff, or what I thought was quite clever, the tweet from the chatter? So that I thought it was quite cute. So you don't have to believe that at all. So trying to separate what is important, what is misinformation, what is relevant information, research has been looking at as well. So knowing that that's where we find ourselves now, what does research look like today? And I've added pretty pictures, so you don't necessarily have to read along. You can just see what the pictures mean. I took a lot of effort to find the right one. So the first one is that a lot of researchers try to find different ways in which to approach these sort of studies when it comes to mental health and well-being. A lot of studies have looked at screen time as an indication for whether someone is what the effects of screen time on someone's mental health and well-being. Similarly, notification management and those kinds of things. For me, I feel like it needs to be looked at what the content is that's being shared on social media rather than just the general use of cell phones or the use of screen time. So a lot of research finds itself looking at screen time as proxies for the real issue or deeper issues that could arise from looking at the study a little bit deeper. Then what I also find fascinating is that there's sort of two schools of thought when it comes to the effect that mental health has on social media. Not the schools that you would think, though. Both of these schools of thought believe that there is an impact that social media use has on mental health, but one school believes that there's a significant effect that social media plays. The other one believes that there's almost a negligible relationship between the use of social media and mental health, which I thought was quite fascinating. And then sort of two more gaps that I would like to look at in more detail is the propagation of information. There is there's a computer scientist at Georgia Tech. Her name is on all of these slides over here. She's been involved in all of these. Professor Munwinter Chowdhury. She recommended, and she's very big in this space when it comes to mental health and social media use specifically. She does mention that the spreading of information is something where there is a gap and that needs to be filled as well. Lastly, just the ethics of all of this. I think there is an underlying question of, I'm posting stuff on social media, who has access to it? How can I use it? And there is a concern about that, that without there being definitive without the agency of the social media user being able to say, I want you to use this data or not, it just encourages platforms to keep you on the app for longer without having a regard for the social media user, and also taking that agency away from someone who may be in danger when it comes to these platforms, because there does seem to be adverse effects when you're on these platforms. Right. So knowing that these are holes that need to be filled, where are we going? Where do we see ourselves taking this research a little bit further? And there again, you see my social media handles. Follow me. Right. So we started off in 2020 with this research by just looking at what academia says and what literature says are the effects or what causes depression, because I thought that was a good place to start. It was a good place to start. And so Lisa Fulyoon did a bibliometric study using co-citation analysis and quite a few other metrics to try and determine what literature says. And it was quite physiological, and it was a lot of medical journals as well. And so to look at the social media scape was, I think, the social media space was sort of the next step for us. And so in 2021, I had two students, Naleen Potgieter, who looked at a correlational study between the factors that impact someone's, the popularity of tweets. So what are the factors that influence someone's tweet becoming popular, using the Rugby World Cup as a case study. And then Zibo Kabenga, who used a game theoretic approach when it comes to influencers on social media. How should they maximize their engagement when they are in these on Twitter itself? Twitter is one of the spaces that are used most often when it comes to research, but I think there's also a need for the highly visual data, because I think social media is all trying to move towards that, the video space, which in and of itself is completely different kettle of fish, and we're not boiling fish in a kettle. That's not what we're doing. And then I currently have two students who are doing sort of amazing work with Francois Oberholzer. Hi, Francois, who is doing a clustering analysis on hate speech on social media with fascinating preliminary results in that regard, using K-means clustering, fuzzy C-means, and DB-scan as well. And we're excited to see where it sort of ends up going during this write-up period now. And then also we have Zane, who's doing an agent-based modeling approach when it comes to trends on social media. How do trends behave on Twitter specifically? And then it's my research. So all of these research projects have helped to inform and psych me up to get to this point in my research. I think it's a daunting task, but very exciting nonetheless, to try and take a social network analysis approach when it comes to social media. I mean, come on, there's no better. I mean, when you think about social networks, you see users as nodes and being connected by sort of edges that are either followers or relationships, communications between them. So I feel like it's sort of a good place to pierce the bubble when it comes to this field that requires, tools in order to improve the public health. And so it's sort of broken up into this long journey. I would like to think of this as the PhD cinematic universe, where all of them are sort of broken up into different phases, and sort of first looking at what does a person on social media look like when they engage with these kinds of topics and these kinds of information that they're being confronted with. Second of all, trying to model that as a social network itself, and then from there trying to find interventions to this network in which we can improve the health of the social media user and also the health of the network in general. And so see if you can spot the green. So ultimately, to the ends of trying to achieve three things. One, we want to improve the experience that people have on social media so that they can look after themselves and have the agency to be able to take control of their own mental health and well-being. Second of all, to raise awareness when it comes to mental health, because again, there is still a stigma. As much as we know about it, there is still a lot of misconceptions, and it's still sort of new. So I think we're all we don't know how to deal with the information that we're with, given that we've been confronted with it again in these recent times that we've just been thrust onto online spaces. And lastly, I think there's an opportunity there to also inform the way that platforms give the agency back to the social media users, rather than just informing the way that it's being used by encouraging them to stay on there for much longer. I would value your questions very much, and I really want to open up the floor, because I think it's very important that not only your questions, but also your stories are important in this research. So thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes.
Secondly, you're very brave to be doing this research. It's not easy, I can see. And I, in particular, I guess to getting to my question, the ethics are incredible. One of the things I'm thinking is of the Cambridge Analytica study. I'm sure you're aware of that. And essentially the finding that there's some ability to influence people's behavior and emotions from social media. And I wonder, given that power, if we're able to additionally detect if people are in a bad space, not acting starts to seem unethical. Do you have any thoughts on that dynamic as to where this is going? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for your question. It's very valid as well. And I feel like a bad person for saying that Cambridge Analytica story was very exciting to see, but also very terrifying because in the wrong hands, it can be used in a very dangerous way. And so whatever the outcome of this research, it's not to diagnose. It is not to be used by researchers who have no idea of anything when it comes to the things that mental health practitioners are very sort of familiar with and have studied. So if anything, it should always be in collaboration with people who are experts within mental health spaces, and or a flag in conjunction with these people who know more. But the ethical concerns are there for sure, and it's very terrifying. Also, I thought that being able to get this research done or getting this data would, or I thought it'd be stopped at every corner. But it seems like when it comes to Twitter, they welcome research when it is for the benefit of the social media users, and it is always going to be shared and disseminated with the people who are the constituents of this, not the constituents, the individuals who will benefit from this research the most. And so that's always been the loophole when it comes to ethics. But it is a big concern of mine, and sort of why it took me 3 years to ramp up to presenting this at all.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, I have a comment. I think what I'm most excited to see from your research too is we all feel like we know mental health control now because we've all been through a pandemic. We know isolate and mask and whatever. And I'm so excited to see what is the digital equivalent of isolating and what is a mask in a social network and what is a vaccination. And then also to see, our instinct is to isolate a COVID-infected person. Is that the right thing to do? Isolate a depressed person, and maybe we find counterintuitive. So I'm very excited to see the things we think we know, how we can't just apply the same rule everywhere. So good deed and vacuum.
But if you see me again, you'll know the answer to that, hopefully. Yes.
I have a question on perhaps more the technical side.
Right.
But the fun technical, the mathematical. Regarding data,
Yes.
just a bit more how that went, because sampling period itself, did that coincide with the COVID period itself? And is it only take Twitter, for example? Is it Facebook as well? Can you tell us a bit more about the data landscape?
Sure. So I'm very fortunate that I'm sitting in an ethical considerations period at the moment before drawing any data. So I have time to think about that a little bit. What I will say is that with what we find very difficult is we don't know what to search for on social media when it comes to this. people can just be quite sarcastic on social media when it comes to these kinds of conversations. So which is where Dr. Stephanie Merchant from Bath is going to bring some fascinating insights in the recommendation that we look at a sample of individuals who we know have depression and are speaking about mental health issues in particular, and using that on Twitter and potentially Reddit as well, because the community itself is different. It is a community-based platform rather than just a text microblogging platform. So the data collection part is underway. And also very an exciting part. You're very right, it is the exciting part.
That leads to another question regarding representativeness of the sample itself that you mentioned. How are you going to even measure that? Yeah, we thought about those parts.
I am very scared. I'll be honest, I'm very terrified. So we want to handle this research with care, and we want to make sure that it is not done with malice or with unjust intentions in any way. And so when it comes to data collection part in itself, we're going to try and consult with as many people who are willing to listen as possible, so that we can do this in a way that is representative of just the right, the people that we need to affect the most change.
You don't want a limited supply of mental health. I'm just thinking from a statistical point of view, you want to event conclusion to a whole information out there.
Well, that's also where a little bit of scoping needs to come into play, because mental health disorders can mean eating disorders, it can mean depression, it can mean anxiety, it can mean anything that I've maybe not even touched on today. And so there's a possibility that we are going to scope. Not the possibility, we are going to scope. And I've scared my supervisor in Bath by saying that I want to look at depression specifically. And so we're taking a big bite, and hopefully we can chew everything that comes our way.
That's the way. Go on filtering with windmills. I applaud the way, but so well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time.
Sha-Abaan, jy kan maar kom hoor, ons is amper. Die tyd is.
Sorry, I can't.
It's time. Our next speaker is Sha-Abaan Slamang, and Sha-Abaan is, in his one life, he's a supply chain analyst at ShopRite. In his other life, he's an MD student at our department. And today he's going to be presenting the other life. The topic of his presentation is towards a graduate success analysis model. And the floor is yours, Sha-Abaan. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. So I'll be speaking about my master's topic that I'm currently busy with. So it's towards a graduate success analysis model, which I'm currently being supervised by Dr. Lishan Fenter. So the order of today is I'll give a bit about my introduction, followed by my problem statement, a bit about the background in terms of what is currently being done or was done, and then currently where I am now. So just a bit more about myself. I'm currently at the ShopRite company as a supply chain analyst. I'm almost there for about 2 years. I'm enjoying it. A bit about my education. I started in logistics management, followed by my honors in quantitative management, and I'm pursuing my master's part-time. So now I'll be giving a bit of talking about my introduction. So Stellenbosch University aims to be one of the leading research institutions on the African continent. Stellenbosch currently has 10 different faculties: the actuarial science, agri-science, arts and social sciences, economic management sciences, education, engineering, law, medicine and health sciences, military sciences, theology, and normal sciences. My studies focuses on the EMS faculty, as that's where my degree is currently based in. So in order for you to become successful within the EMS faculty, you have to follow the selection procedure in order for you to be successful in this. So for that, there is 4 selection criteria. The first one is where you need a minimum of 50% in your home language, being English or Afrikaans, followed by 60% in your first additional language and 60% for mathematics. This can differ depending on the degree you are enrolled for and other criteria. The second one is your NBT results. The third is the admission requirement for your degree specifically. So if you are enrolled for mathematical sciences, your mathematics mark would be a minimum of 80%. Then the fourth one and the last one is your selection mark, which is calculated by the university, which looks at your mathematics mark, which weighs the most, as this counts twice towards the selection criteria, and then as well as your 5 other subjects. So if you have additional, they only take the top 5 and you get a selection mark. So within the MS faculty, there is a bunch of sub-departments or departments, this being the statistics department, school of accountancy, business management, economics, statistics and actuarial science, and industrial psychology. So in order for you to progress within the EMS faculty, you have to pass assessments. So how do you pass assessments and how do you get there? So in order for that, there's something called YEMIS in which you need to meet. So YEMIS is the Higher Education Information Management System, which is just an accumulation of all the credits that is required for your degree. So for that, EMS faculty follow the flexible assessment policy. So for that, you need to at least write 2 out of the 3 main assessments and pass them with a minimum of 50%. So if a student doesn't pass a specific module with 50%, they either have the choice to leave it, to repeat, or if they wanted to improve that mark. So if it is a compulsory module for your degree, you are forced to repeat that module. But if it's a elective, you can simply just choose not to do it anymore and maybe switch things up. So with that, the student then decides, okay, I'm going to repeat the module. If I get 50% or more, then that will be my final mark. Else, if it's less than 50, I'd have to repeat again. So once I pass the module, I get the full YEMIS credit scores for that module. And then at the end of the year, you then get calculated a YEMIS score, which is the total modules which you pass divided by the total credits for your degree. So if you have full marks, you can then progress to your next academic year, moving from first year to second year. But if you have less than 50% of your YEMIS requirements, the university can then ask you to either politely please leave, possibly just change your degree if necessary, or if you're in between 50 and 100%, you are then still like half first year, half second year. Where are you at? Still trying to see where that is. So now that comes to my problem statement of why are students not passing? Who is to blame? And what can we do to help them? The 3 W's. So the Department of Higher Education, DHET, and Stellenbosch University sets out the minimum duration for a degree and also gives the associate credits for that degree for each specific year. So I would like to apply systems thinking to this problem to sort of answer how can we help students progress within university, which leads to my 3 research questions. What systemic factors hinders graduation within the minimum time, and which policies can remedy this? Which systemic factors hinders diversity and intersectionalities within graduation rates, and also which policies can overcome this? And then holistically together, what factors influences both research question 1 and 2? So for example, this could be possibly adding additional learning resources. Could that possibly improve graduation rates? Or could that possibly improve your minimum time? Like, what is that? Or could it possibly be that our basic education system is not good enough, but we are still allowing students into the university, so that our selection criteria be reviewed and altered? So hopefully, through this research, we'll help uncover what are these problems and how can we remedy this. So now I'll be providing you just with a little bit of background of previous attempts at this model building section and how can we remedy this. So in 2016, Victor Ramsamy attempted this model through a system dynamics approach where he simulated the flow of students and progression and graduate based on their different intersectionalities. So for Victor, students were very homogeneous and scope was a bit large. So in terms of that, Victor focused on all the compulsory modules and grouped them together. So as seen in this figure over here, where Victor just followed on, like, these are the compulsory modules for first year. He only looked at them. These were the second year ones, and those are the third ones. So you've only looked at compulsory modules and eliminated the choice within the module. But this led to a lot of complexity within the model, as well as if we just follow his diagram, we can see that if a student didn't pass a single one of the compulsory modules, they automatically went to year. Whereas if they passed everything, they then moved to second year. So following Victor's attempt, Celine then attempted a similar model, but sort of scaling that down and focusing on Bachelor of Accounting degree. So with Celine's attempt, she also followed a system dynamics approach to solve this problem, where in her research, she applied concepts of agent-based simulation within the different stock types and the way that they could flow. So it could be a student passes one module but fails another one. So within the B accounting degree, it's very restrictive as you don't have much choice modules. It's very like you have to do this or you don't get your degree. So with that, that's the problem which Celine followed. So in figure 3, you can see for accounting, this is the path in which you follow. So you do accounting 178 to accounting 278 to accounting 378. So it's very like you follow a specific pattern. So if we look at figure 2, this is her system dynamics implementation. We can see that this follows more or less a discrete event simulation approach, where it's very much I go from one place to another place to another place, but done within system dynamics. So we can see within this approach, there's very little feedback within the model, and it's more a discrete event simulation approach. So with Celine's approach, you can see that complexity was still a problem, that it is present in the model, and that through her different ways of having her stocks, we can then see that possibly a new simulation technique is required, such as agent-based simulation. So following Celine, Alyssa and Caitlin then attempted 2 separate agent-based simulation models, but focusing on other areas of education simulation. So if we look at Alyssa, she looked at toddlers within the model, where she then looked at toddlers between the age of 2 and 6 and looked at different characteristics of them in agent-based simulation. So what are the toddlers' age, their family type, their health, and their early childhood development type. So was it very formal? Did they go to school, or was it just they stayed at home, informal, and their parents assisted them with that? So within Alyssa's model, you initially moved into the state chart. So this one over here, figure 4. You went into a state, and you would then move from a state which she had as you either achieved the standard, or you're falling behind, or you are at risk within the toddler system. So you would then move between these different states based on your pass probability, which was calculated using Bayesian statistics. And this information came from the General Household Survey. And then once a learner reached age 6, they automatically moved out of the toddler system as they then became ready for grade 1. This then followed Perry's attempt at looking at the primary school model, where she modeled grade 1 to 6, and she looked at different factors such as the school type, were they in quintile 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? So were they a fee school or no fee school? Then the age, their gender, their parents' education, their health, their family status, so were they single, married, divorced, and what was their pass probability. All of this information came from the NIDS, the National Income Dynamics Survey. So if looking at figure 5, a state chart within agent-based simulation, you could see that all of these characteristics was the student ahead of the system? Did they exceed it? Did they just meet the minimum standard, or were they behind? How far were they behind? So within her model, if a child was enrolled in grade 1 and they were 6 years old, they then met the standard. But if they were grade 1 and say 5 years old, they were possibly exceeding the standard. Whereas say you're grade 1 and you are 10 years old, you are then 4 years behind the system. So within Perry's agent-based simulation, the lower you are on the state chart, as 4 years behind, the more difficult it is for you to sort of catch up later on as you progress. So both Perry and Sereni's attempt then led to the approach of that agent-based simulation is the right attempt and is the right simulation paradigm to model student progression. But there's still an element missing. So that's where it leads us to the current approach of mine, where I'll be following a hybrid simulation approach using both system dynamics and agent-based simulation. So within agent-based simulation, I'll be physically moving the students from first year to second year to third year to graduation, whereas system dynamics would follow the more approach of what are the factors that influence the student moving from first year to second year. So all of this will be done within AnyLogic, as this supports both paradigms of simulation of agent-based simulation and system dynamics. And through this, I'll be applying some statistical regression models in order to calculate the initial input variables, as well as logistics regression, as well as Bayesian's theorem to calculate the probabilities in which a student might move from first year to second year. So within that, so figure 5 is my agent-based simulation state chart, where you are either first year, second year, or third year. And in order for you to move from first year, this is all dependent on your year miss credit. So did I meet that full amount? If I did not, I'll remain in first year. So until I meet that full amount of credits, I can't move first year to second year and vice versa. And if I don't have 50% within my year miss credits, I automatically drop out of the system. Whereas the system dynamics approach on the side looks at factors that influence that. So these factors was based off my honors research, which was the high school model. So just looking at those factors to see, are they also relevant in higher education? So this could be your academic success. Do you have financial support? Is that something that might impact you because you're more stressed with something? It's like, no, you don't need to think about that stresses. You can just do what you want within university. So those are a few examples of the factors that I will be looking at currently. Thank you. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Sha-Abaan. Questions? Yes.
Very interesting presentation. Yeah, maybe go back to your last slide and maybe expand a bit more. So I'm struggling to understand, are you going to compare the two methods, or does the system dynamics approach just influence the characteristics of your agents?
Yeah, so the system dynamics would sort of influence that pass probability. So it's like, would it like amplify it or decrease your pass probability? So this would sort of be like, okay, yes, your system is very strong, so therefore you're more likely to pass. Whereas your system is very weak, so you are less likely to then pass in the system.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I'm just wondering, does your model address students that are on open distance learning, like at UNISA, we do your students that are working and also studying? Do you put such parameters in the model?
So currently, no. So it just focuses on like the Stellenbosch University. So whether it's sort of you fully enrolled or not. So with that characteristics is sort of hard to determine from the data, as if you are enrolled for a bachelor's, any degree, it's sort of you are full-time. There's no like part-time option within like a first degree, bachelor's degree.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the preso, super cool. On the attributes on the right, which one or ones give you the most sleepless nights around defining?
Possibly looking at your social support. So like, what is that fully classified? Is that just your friends? Is that your family? Is it look at just your current environment, or do you look at your support from home as well? And then possibly like lecture effectiveness, like how do I quantify the effectiveness?
Other students, that's zero, you know. Lecturers don't have effectiveness at all. That's the easy one. Any other questions? Yes. Any other questions? Seems I like you off the hook then, Sha-Abaan. Thank you very much for the presentation. You go.
Something with the mouth.
Something with the mouth.
With a what? The Eldanas.
Yeah.
What? Doesn't mean anything.
Eldana, modder niemand is synoniem. Jy lieg aan jy kan nie mix it. There's no other type of moths.
He talks about some more. That doesn't sound familiar. What about Eldanas?
Sê pas jy Eldana, as jy modder en lieke saam het, dan is dit synoniem met Eldana. Sure.
Ja, ik zie het veel doen. Ja, dat hoef je niet te zoeken, niet? Maar ik bedoel, als je je zoekt, dan kan je zelf verslag blijven.
Komt nog baie tyd.
Lekker.
Lekker nog maar.
Good idea.
Het jy die antwoord?
Ja, je ziet waar je moet schrijven. Als je eigenlijk weet wat van de andere lekker is.
That's good.
Ben niet aan het nemen, maar.
Bij de kind dat je oude.
Ik heb de eerste keer nog gebruikt voor een boekhouder en nou dag. Als dit een nooit
I told you yesterday that
Just can't get double hot more.
so much caffeine.
We should have another.
Yeah. Next. Enquanto for cost, the cost On Monday, yes, it was. Yeah. I don't like this project that. Yeah, I'm writing. Yeah. It's not have to be like more responsible. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Like the last week before everyone's it's too late. What the other day? Yes, it's like spending down. We have a second one, then the inventory. Okay, at least we have one. It's interesting.
Ideas.
Ja, daarvan afkomt. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Sleep. It's just awesome. And I think so. I want to make my time. But I think but I never think
It is 10 o'clock, so let's go to our next and penultimate speaker. So our next speaker is Philip. About something else. And I was thinking about how I'm going to formulate it, but he, as Sha-Abaan, has a lower bound. That's what I was thinking about. Has a lower bound of at least 2 lives, and in his one life, he's a data scientist at Capitec, and in his other life, he is a master student in our department, and he's going to represent that second life that I'm talking about in this presentation, and he's going to talk about the development of an Eldana risk index. Thank you, Philip.
The word data scientist is a little bit stronger. I think it's more somebody well versed in reading tea leaves at a corporate scale. Is it? What we do. The Eldana topic has been discussed quite thoroughly throughout the years in research, and I'll try and point out the difference that this project aims to achieve. The quick background, so we'll just discuss the elements contained in the risk elements or in the risk model. So it's sugarcane and the moth, Notorious Eldana moth. These things, sugarcane and Eldana, has been researched and presented at this conference and all over thoroughly. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with those. I'll try and spend more time on the integrated risk framework and then the model we developed. At first, because these things have been so well presented, I tried to pick all the pictures that I haven't seen in presentations. So, sugarcane, it originated from one main cultivar, which is the red one there, Sufficient Saccharum officinarum. That was about 5000 BC, apparently. I don't know how they normally quantify those sort of statements. But after that, as it was domesticated throughout Asia and then North America, South America, there was two other main cultivars that was established. Modern cultivars are all complex hybrids. So all of them are bred with specific traits in mind. So resistance, pest and climate resistance, yield improvement, those sort of things. In terms of the global scale, what is quite fascinating is it is the world's largest crop by volume. So 1.8 billion tons produced in 2017. It's quite a lot of tons. So that was the stuff I thought that I haven't seen in presentation before. It's quite neat about sugarcane. If we look at South Africa's industry, we produced our first cane in the 1800s. We produced it across KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape. We've got 14 sugar mills. We've got two main bodies, SASRI, South African Sugarcane Research Institute, and then the Sugar Milling Research Institute. If you talk about our scale of about 360,000 hectares that we produce, 2.3 million tons per year. We're quite, not necessarily, I think we're even in the top 15. I think Brazil is number one. They produce, I think, 40% of the world's sugarcane, which is large scale. The challenges and starting to define the why of the project. So globally, there's been an increase in the regulation of the sugar content in consumer goods. That has also transpired into many countries implementing sugar taxes. So this is placing a lot of stress and complexities on all the industries in terms of being more effective and efficient in the way that they produce. The South African industry has not only had to fight the introduction in South Africa of some of these sugar taxes as well, but in the last few years, the industry has been under pressure due to droughts, and there's the impact of pests. That's the reason for this project being Eldana. If we look at the last few years, there's an estimated 1.3 billion loss in revenue in the industry and about 10,000 jobs at risk if it continues the current trend. Then going over to the moth, this has been discussed a lot. I think all of you know this. These things look basically, moth flies around, the worm chows the sugarcane, and it's just, it's bad. If we look at the impact of Eldana, currently it's estimated that in the South African industry, about R1 billion per annum is lost due to Eldana-related causes. The direct losses is not necessarily in scale the most severe. The indirect losses from the changes and the strategies that the industry had to implement at the cost of yield and profitability is also a very severe scale. Because of the scale and the severity of the impact, it's also necessitated research to try and and develop cultivars that are more resistant. Just to tie back to the why, the risk index project is the ultimate aim is to support the BT cane project. I think Samantha, you're presenting on that after this. So what the Eldana risk index is trying to achieve is to predictively or strategically identify risk or a probability of infestation, so that the BT cane cultivar can be deployed there, so they can have good research results in terms of a control and the control groups. So that's the ultimate aim of the risk index. If we start looking at the framework, there's the difference in this project is as follows. So there's on sugarcane, there's sophisticated models that are discretely modeling the yield, the phenological processes of the plant. There's a lot of research, years and years of research. This project was not going to try in any way attempt to discretely model any phenological process of the plant, rather use what is existing, what is available, and integrate into the model. Same with the Eldana research. There's various Eldana models, the degree day abundance models, the dispersion models, the population simulation models, sterile insect technique models. There's various models. The ERI was not supposed to go and try and produce a more sophisticated version of any one of those things, rather use or integrate what is available. So project, or this is the problem statement. In essence, I'll try and summarize it. What we're trying to do is you've got the plant, you've got the moth, you've got scenarios and climatic events that make the plant more susceptible to the moth. You've got those same climatic variables that make the moth thrive or not thrive. So these elements are at play throughout the crop season. So what we're trying to do is create a risk index of the two primary domains, be it sugarcane and the Eldana moth, and then look at elements of each one of those that we can call a risk kite. So we'll get to the kite concept now, but what we want to do is create the risk index, create it geographically so that SASRI can integrate that into their current homogeneous climate zone, let's say, framework. I'll show some of that later as well. Because remember, the ultimate aim of this is to predict, strategically identify the probability of infestation in specific areas. So if we start looking at the structure of the model, we've got sugarcane, we've got the moth, and then we've got a cycle. So the basic structure of the model is we've got a 532-day crop cycle or simulation. So it's an 18-month cycle. And throughout that cycle, we'll on a daily time step calculate the risk. The risk will comprise of risk kites. So on the sugarcane side, we have temperature. So how effective is the thermal time that the plant receives? We've got water stress, and then water stress also causes the plant to be more susceptible to Eldana. So that's a secondary dimension to the water stress. And then we've got the Eldana damage in terms of risk. On the Eldana side, we've got the temperature, once again, so the degree day abundance models. We adjust those with a few stresses, so according to temperature or desiccation temperature, desiccation mortality, and then a desiccation mortality due to rain or drought. That's how we adjust the Eldana population. The functioning of the model and some background on the available data. So there's two elements that we will consume from the SASRI, let's say their suite of tools to the industry. So the first thing is they've got various weather stations across the cane producing areas in South Africa. So each one of those weather stations, they've got very rich daily time series data of various variables. So the first input or first primary input to the model is the weather station data. The second input to the model for each one, let's say for each year or each month of weather data that we have, we initiate a cane sim simulation or model output. This is the SASRI cane sim model, and we initialize an instance of the model for each one of those. Then in terms of trying to validate some of the things, we've got field observations. So these are manual surveys that they go and do in terms of trying to cut down 100 stalks, cut them open, count the larvae. But the problem with the observation or let's say the field data is that it's very difficult to build any sort of, it's complex to go and build statistical validation on that, because each one of those surveys are specific to that area, that time, that climatic variables between or after. So it's difficult to aggregate that onto a large scale. You can say this is relative or predictive risk. That was one of the main challenges of the project, and also it influenced the design structure of the model quite heavily. The next slide is we'll speak to that. So, as I said earlier, so it's a 532-day time step. That is initialized for the whole historic data set of each weather station. So, for instance, let's say the weather station has data since 1990. You will initiate a model for, we used the 4 prime, let's say, crop planting months. So that's October, November, December, and January. And you initiate a model for each one of those months that runs a 532-day cycle. And you do that for the whole span of the weather station's data. So each one of those is a cane sim model simulation that's kicked off. The ideal state of the model is to be, let's say, run or initialized across the full spectrum of all the weather stations, and then to start utilizing the forecasting capability of the cane sim model. So because we've built the model on the weather station data and the cane sim data, which is stock standard data updates, if you start using the forecasting capability of the cane sim model, the model can just run on that. But there's no problem in terms of future integration. If we start looking at the specific elements of the model, so as we discussed earlier, so there's a risk element to each one of these that we're going to quantify or express as relative risk. So the first one, we look at Eldana, and here we apply from the current literature the degree day abundance models. We adjust them with the desiccation stresses and the mortalities, and we get to a relative Eldana population figure. That is across each, let's say, crop cycle, each 532-day cycle. But that can, because we initiated the model across the full data set of all weather stations, you can roll that up to calendar months, calendar years, previous years, historic years. So you basically build your own, let's say, large data set that you can later use to quantify relative risk. If we go to sugarcane, once again, it's just these are outputs from the cane sim model. It's effective thermal time. We use the thermal time construct to create a thermal index. So how effective or how optimal was the temperature or the thermal time received from the plant, and that we also do across crop cycles, and then that can be rolled up to any dimension of the model. Water stress, same concept. The cane sim model produces the water satisfaction index. For the purpose of the ERI model, we just reversed it. So in the SASRI model, 100 means no stress, 0 means a lot of stress. Just to make calculations easier in the ERI, just swap it around again so that a higher number means higher risk. Then the crop damage element on the sugarcane side is we use, from the current literature, there's estimations of the stalk length that grows every single day according to the thermal, let's say, the thermal time that the plant receives. We also use an estimated feeding rate per large larvae degree day. So that's based on your large larvae population. Catch that. These are all the phenological phases that we model for the Eldana moth. So the large larvae phases are these last ones here. So for every large larvae degree day, you can then estimate what the feeding rate will be. That feeding rate is then just a multiplied by a constant rate, and that give you the average, let's say, stalk length board or your percentage damage per day. All of these factors are then converted into a risk kite. So the risk kite concept is as follows. You've got an optimal value. So for each one of those elements that we looked at in terms of risk, there's optimal values, and then there's the actual observed value from the weather station and the cancer model. What we do is we create the optimal variable by basically setting the thermal temperatures and everything to the optimal value, and that creates this optimal line. And then the actual values, the observed values, is then calculated, and the risk kite, or the risk per element, is then the cumulative difference between these two curves. That is then rolled up for every crop cycle, calendar months, and then across all the years. In the next, or let's say the final steps, once this is run across all the weather stations, is to then start creating so the risk, let's say, levels to calibrate or configure the what we say is relative risk. Is this year higher or lower than last year, than the last 5 years? Then if we start forecasting with the cancer model, is the forecast higher or lower than the last 3 years, 5 years, the long-term mean? So to express that relative risk across each area. The future steps then, as I said, is run it across the full data set or across all the weather stations. Each one of those risks elements, we've got an initial version in there, but in due time, you can replace each one of those elements with the best-in-class model for that specific domain to just enhance the accuracy or the predictive capability of the model. And one thing that we want to go and explore, hopefully in the future, is that one of the biggest drawbacks of this project was the complexity of the Eldana data. You don't have rich quality time series data when it comes to Eldana. It doesn't exist. So there's solutions that we've seen in especially in the first world countries, where they have three-dimensional sensors and they use machine learning and AI models to give a relative abundance real-time figure. So it senses that picks up pests. So you calibrate it according to this pest, the body size, the frequency that it flaps its wings. So you create a machine learning model that is honed to identify a specific pest. And this sensor sits in the field and it collects real-time data. It's not a count, but it's a relative abundance figure. That's real-time. It's time series data. So if we can integrate something like this into the ERI model, it will be powerful in terms of its predictive capability. And that's my story.
Your timing is absolutely impeccable. I mean, it's 1 second off 20 minutes. Well done. Any questions? Yes.
When you deliver sugar, I mean, the mill that I worked in, you got paid per, for the sucrose content, from weighbridge data of the truck. To what extent is that sucrose a proxy for the level of infestation? Do they know, or don't?
We don't. The data probably exists. Does it exist in a accessible, aggregated form? Probably not. But if we definitely use that, definitely. If we see a spike in Eldana population and we correlate that with that year, the sucrose content at the mills were lower, that can be another angle to start validation. But I've not known about that data. I don't know if you're aware of that data, but that's certainly something that we can explore.
And then another thing, an easy way of counting I was just thinking about it while you were presenting now. I mean, sonar is something that you can do very quickly. I mean, you push the stalk through. I think, okay, you need some, other software maybe, but you will be able to see damage inside without actually cutting it open. Cutting it open is
The complexity of this project and the drawback was the low confidence in the manual Eldana data. So there's very little reproducibility in it, and moving away from that. So getting any sort of automation or automatic collected data. You can use it as a proxy to indicate relative presence of Eldana, but that needs to be explored. I think the reliance on the manual survey data is ample. It's ample to the project.
because I know that they actually draw physical stalks.
100 stalks, yeah.
Then that serves as the representation of the sucrose.
The reading that you get there, even though if it was quality captured, everything done right, it's still relevant to that specific field, that specific spot, that specific climatic factors, and only in that you don't have. How did that change a month ago? That's a drawback. You've got very rich time series data in terms of the Keynes model outputs that you can simulate and the weather station data. If you can have that same type of time series dimension to the Eldana data, it can be powerful.
It's always a problem. The research institutes have a certain amount of funding, and they have to decide where do they canalize that money, and they don't necessarily canalize that towards getting useful Eldana data. So they've been relying a lot on these manual sampling for many years, and but hopefully we get the message across one day that they need to invest in this manual.
Any other questions?
Maybe a comment. Yes, thanks for the presentation. We struggle. It's about that time of the year. Locusts around and on the Eldana line, they eat the rails. I'm joking. They don't. Wheel spin. The local wheel spin, and then all sorts of bad stuff happening. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that problem or human yet, but I mean, I'd be interested to see if there's any generalization around just kind of understanding the patterns, because yeah, it's a problem, and the Department of Agriculture they have their hands up in there.
I come from Northern Cape, so I'm aware of that problem.
Our link, we must exchange the moth for the locust.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Philip.
I don't know.
Said it's not gonna.
Oh, wow.
So unnecessary. Getting myself.
Will you have?
Number time step.
Okay, let's start our final presentation. Philip has now warmed us up for sugarcane and moths and Eldana and all these things. So I think we should keep up the momentum with the next presentation. So our next presenter is Samantha Downing, and she will be presenting on determining the size of refuge areas required in PD sugarcane when combined with sterile insect releases. Thank you, Samantha. We'll start your presentation.
I'd like to thank Philip for giving a good introduction and warm-up to the topic. So yes, I think that there's a lot that the audience and the conference is already aware of in terms of Eldana. But South Africa has been in combat with this pest since the 1970s, and the moths are attracted to the sugarcane plantation because of the dead leaf material, which is dark and moist and an ideal place for the egg laying. These eggs then hatch, and the larvae bore into the stalk and consume the soft tissue inside, reducing the sucrose yield, stunting the growth of younger plants, and ultimately reducing the harvest yield. The sterile insect technique is a birth control measure whereby a proportion of the native population is sterilized using radiation. And this is considered quite an environmentally friendly method. However, it is costly in terms of time and money. And the BT sugarcane method is genetically modified crops, which contain bacteria from the Bacillus thuringiensis. And this is quite toxic to the larvae. Ultimately, when the larvae ingest this bacterium, they starve to death. And but however, there is a potential that the moths may develop resistance over time to this bacterium, and it may lose its effect over a few generations. There have been successful implementations of both of these, and the SASRI, the South African Sugarcane Research Institute, has researched both of these methods, but this research aims to investigate the combination. Previous research in this top, in relation to this research has been done by Dr. Lincoln-Potgieter, which aimed to investigate the different sterile moth release strategies and present guidelines by which release ratios, frequencies, and distributions may be estimated, as well as by DJ Heman, and his research aimed to investigate the different refuge strategies with regards to size, distribution, and the shape of refuge. DJ Heman found that a single large centralized refuge area at 20% of the plantation size could be recommended. And so that was implemented in this research as well. And then smaller sizes were investigated. This research aims to investigate the effect of the sterile insect technique on the development of resistance in an Eldana population infesting BT sugarcane, while taking into account various SIT release ratios, as well as a release frequency of 14 days and various methods of release, such that BT sugarcane will be feasible to be used in the plantation for at least 20 years. A release frequency of 14 days was decided upon as Dr. Lincoln-Potgieter's research recommended a 7-day release ratio. However, that was also a release ratio which is decided upon at the beginning of the period, counting the moths that are already in existence, whereas this research implements a dynamic ratio which is taken in real time, in a real-time count of the moths. Certain assumptions are made in this research. Firstly, that the model is modeled as a 1-year crop, with a harvest procedure taking place at the end of 365 days in accordance with the practice in the KwaZulu-Natal coastal region. It is also assumed that the egg, larval, and pupal life stages are combined into one immobile object in the model, and this is due to the simplicity of these life stages and the fact that the research only focuses on the effects of the larval life stage, really. Thirdly, that the harvesting results in the removal of all pests, except for the larval objects in the egg phase, and only 3% of other larvae will survive. And this is due to the fact that when a harvest procedure takes place, generally the moths fly away or migrate to another plantation nearby. Fourthly, a female lays 20 to 25 eggs after fertilization, and this represents the number of total individuals who would have survived the random and predatory mortality of the first 2 life stages. The resistant gene, which may present in the population, is considered recessive. And 6, the largest amounts of BT proteins will be ingested once the larva bores into the stalk. And so BT proteins ingested by the larvae in the leaf material are not taken into account. And 7, the effect of BT proteins on board larvae is not immediate, and they will eventually starve to death, and such the larval mortality as a result of ingesting the proteins is only applied once at the end of the life phase. This is just an example of the user interface that was developed, and agent-based modeling was used as a method because of the individual nature of the characteristics of the moths, as well as the interest that the research has in the interaction between the moths and their environment. So we can see that the refuge area implemented is centralized, and this is also due to the simulation only modeling a 1 hectare area, and because of the computing capability of the program. So we can see that there are pink and blue marks. Those are male and female. Once they mate, they turn green. And then the orange marks are the releases. The user can then change the variables of the frequency, the ratio, the strategy of release, the radius of mating, and then the initial resistance of the population. There are various parameters taken into account in the model, and this is just a brief look at what they are and their potential values that they could take. In the model, we start off with the user initializing the user interface and setting the parameters. Then the temperature for the day is set based on the day of the year. This is taken as an average of the temperature in the region across the month. Then a harvest procedure takes place if we are at 365 days, whereby the pests will be removed in the simulation, except for that small percentage. And then the sugarcane grows with a proportion according to the temperature of the day. And then the moths mature by adding 1 day to their age. The moths then undergo mortality, whereby if they are of 5 days of age, there will be a 50% chance of mortality. And then when the moths are 7 days old, they will just simply be removed from the simulation. The moths then move around unbiased, and then they undergo a mating procedure, which will be discussed in detail to follow. The larvae then mature at a proportion of the temperature, also taking into account their life stage, and then larval mortality occurs. This is just as a result of the random or predatory mortality. Then the eggs are laid as a result of the mating procedure. And then the time step is checked if it is in line with the frequency set by the user. A release will either occur or not, and then the time step will increase and the day will increase by 1 as well, and the process continues. In the mating procedure, a female moth will check if she is female, unmated, and of mature age to be mating. She will then check the area around her, and if there is an unmated male in the area, then they will pair up as mates. They will change green and a link will be formed. Then the female is assigned a number of eggs between 20 and 25. And the genes of the male are inherited by the female to pass on to the eggs. This is the sterility gene from the male, as only the male sterile are sterilely released. And then also the resistance gene of the male and the female will be stored to be assigned to the egg. In the laying procedure, the female lays a certain percentage of her eggs dependent on the day that she is post-fertilization. And this is according to a distribution that is set forth by literature. And yes, then the number of eggs that she contains are reduced each day. The resistance gene is assumed to be recessive by this research. And if we're looking at this Punnett square, that would mean that in the case that the resistance gene is the large R, only in the red case will the offspring also be resistant. If both of their parents are resistant, then the offspring will be resistant. And in all other cases, the offspring will be susceptible to the Bt proteins. Then 3 experiments were conducted in this research. First, each experiment was run 10 times for 7 years each, and implementing a 14-day release frequency. Then the following measures were measured at each experiment: the total days that the experiment ran for, the maximum percentage of resistant larvae, the number of larvae that were present at maximum resistance, the day of maximum resistance, the day of 50% resistance, and if a resistance breakthrough occurred, and then finally the final number of larvae present in the simulation at the end of 7 years. In the first experiment, this was run without SIT implemented and at various refuge area sizes on Bt sugarcane. And there is the single centralized refuge area taken into account. A size of 20% was recommended by DJ Himan, and so this research focuses on smaller refuge area sizes, especially because of the small scale of the simulation only being 1 hectare. In the runs that developed 100% resistance, the population generally did die out, and that's due to the fact that the fully resistant population consisted of few individuals, and a harvest procedure occurred right after the total resistance was reached. So the number above these points are the number of runs that did experience a population breakthrough. We see that with 0% refuge area, the BT sugarcane isn't sufficient to prevent a population explosion. And in general, nearby 50% of the population will become resistant to the proteins over time. As we increase the refuge area size, the number of runs with the population explosion do decrease with it, and then eventually we can eliminate resistance as well as the population explosions. In the 5% refuge area, the runs with a population explosion had the total resistance occurring shortly after the 2-year mark, and this did happen at least slower than in the BT case. In the 10% refuge area size, there were 5 runs where the population did not die out, and that was because without the SIT, the larger refuge area did work to suppress the population but not eradicate it. A larger refuge area size is not enough because the population can still be sustained within the refuge area. Then in the 15% refuge area, this was sufficient to prevent a significant development of resistance, and the BT still remains effective in suppressing the population. In our second experiment, this was run on just an entirely BT environment with SIT implemented at various release ratios. This is to investigate the isolated impact of the SIT releases. And the ratio is a dynamic ratio. In the 5-to-1 ratio, we see that all runs ended soon after the 1-year mark and the subsequent harvest procedure, except for a run which did achieve 89% of resistance. However, this was due to sterility in the population, and the population was eradicated just before the 2-year mark. When the SIT is implemented on an entirely BT environment, the level of resistance decreases as sterility increases as expected. And we saw that the 8-to-1 and the 10-to-1 ratio did perform quite similarly, and then the 8-to-1 ratio will be favored to reduce the costs. The 8-to-1 ratio did have an improvement on the cases without the SIT, and the high levels of resistance were present in the majority of the runs, but paired with the high levels of sterility, the populations were still eradicated by the end. Then looking at a combination of these two previous experiments, this was investigated in order to see whether the inclusion of a refuge area can reduce the SIT ratio needed, as well as to investigate whether the SIT and the use of refuge areas may adversely interact with one another. And we did note a general adverse reaction when it came to the 10-to-1 ratio. At the 5% refuge area, with the 5-to-1 ratio, so looking at the blue line, we saw that the ratio, that it presented similar results to the 5-to-1 case in experiment 2, where the refuge area was not taken into account. And so you see that inclusion of a 5% refuge area may not have a significant impact with low SIT ratios. However, the resistance developed at a much slower rate. Then we see that with the 5-to-1 and the 8-to-1, they did perform similarly, and so the 5-to-1 would be favored. When we look at the 10-to-1, it presented unexpected results, and this indicates that large release ratios may have an adverse effect on the refuge area size, and a small refuge when only few individuals are included in the simulation. In general, the SIT and the refuge area worked in tandem, effectively eradicating the infestation by suppressing the resistance and maintaining high levels of sterility without requiring total resistance to occur. The population explosions here are of a smaller magnitude than in the other experiments. Then in the last experiment, we investigated the release method and found that the box method did perform significantly better than the aerial method. The aerial method actually accounted for large amounts of the unexpected results we saw in the third experiment. And this was due to the fact that there was a population sustained within the refuge area, while the sterile releases were taking place randomly throughout the plantation, and these sterile releases were not focused on the area of greatest infestation. Also, to explain the population explosions that occurred and the subsequent expansion of the infestation, we'll look at a certain case where a large number of those. So here we see that on the day that the resistance increased, the sterility also increased, and so the sterile insects, or that the resistance could not be passed on. When the resistance increased, the sterility decreased, and so a population explosion could occur, as most of the individuals in that simulation were both resistant and fertile. So the findings were that at high levels of sterility, the resistance does not have a significant effect. And for the BT environment, as resistance decreases, the sterility increases. Higher release ratios result in high levels of sterility as expected. And yes, I think most of these have been addressed in the experiments. Then the recommendations made to SASRI were to include a refuge area at the very least, and that larger refuge area sizes will result in slower development of resistance. However, they do maintain a population. A smaller refuge area size will reduce the population growth, and an SIT is a necessary additional control measure. 14 days would be a reasonable release frequency with these parameters, and SIT releases should be located at high population density areas, and that the box releases were the most effective, and ATV releases were investigated, but they were not sufficient for this for the simulation. In general, I would recommend the following future work, and yes, this has been communicated to SASRI.
Samantha, any questions? Yes, you can go.
Sort of two questions, one more biological and the other one slightly technical. Has it been modeled? In your one workflow, you had that the larva came before the egg. Why was that? Yeah, that's right. Mature larva and then eggs laid.
So the larvae were already existent in the simulation, and it was just the time step in which so the larva would mature, and then the egg laying came from the moths. So the moths were already existent in the simulation as well.
Were the males resistant? Were the released males, were they resistant?
No, they did not. They had a probability of being resistant, but it's very, very low. It is about 1%.
Sorry, how you know how those sterile moths were created?
Yes, through radiation. It's quite interesting. They freeze the eggs and then they send them to the Eastern Cape where the radiation gun is. And then the moths are sterilized in the egg form and then reared in order to separate the males and the females. And then they are frozen again and sent back to KwaZulu-Natal.
And it's a guaranteed sterilization or partial sterilization?
It's pretty much guaranteed, Linka. Any input?
With Eldana, they have 70 as a partial sterility. Because of 100% sterility, their competitiveness reduces too much. So they
damage to.
Yeah, so they do partial sterility, and then the F1 generation inherits sterility. So they still produce eggs at first mating. The next generation is.
So you don't want to introduce a resistant male because you increase the resistance of the population. So it's not like you want to. Well, part of the question was, do you release resistant males so that they survive? Resistant males that they survive and they can breed. that you actually don't want to introduce because there's a possibility that they're going to release?
You release sterile males, so they carry the sterile gene, which is passed on to the next generation. But the resistant gene itself is sufficiently rare, and yeah, it's really a small percentage. So but these simulations are basically, you assume that the resistant gene is there, and you want to, if it's there, you want to control it. And how should you control it? But the current data on these insect populations, it's really so the research is basically modeling occurrence. If it happens, what should we do? But in the case of release of sterile males, I don't think there's research yet on what's the probability of releasing a.
You want to release resistant males, you don't really want to do that because they're going to increase the resistance probability.
Yeah, but according to other insect population data, that resistant gene is very rare. It's
Evolution has become dominant.
maximum about 0.01%.
Evolution has become dominant because they just start picking out.
Yeah, but the other thing is when the radiated population, lab reared moths. So it's not the samples is not collected from in field. So if you were worried that the resistant gene would grow in the wild population, yes. So if you sample from the wild population, then you will end up in your lab with more resistant percentage. But it's a lab reared population that they keep sort of.
That's just a question if you want to release like resistant moths, so they have a higher resistant sterile moths that they have a higher survivability. If you're not doing 100% guarantee that those next generation will be eliminated.
Yes.
So due to the iterative nature of agent-based modeling, any randomness in your agent procedures can sort of compound to change your results quite a bit between runs. So did you have any measures of uncertainty around your estimates?
Yes, that did come into play, but I tried to combat that by using 10 runs for each experiment, and then using the averages of those to find things. But there was definitely a level of uncertainty and variability in the runs.
And then did you just kind of illustrate the variance of those?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about, you mentioned the dispersal of these moths being unbiased. Is that usually as it is found in literature?
No, that is also part of the future work that I recommended, that's to improve on the biological processes of the moths. They have some bias in their movements, and also some it influences their travel as well. So females might travel further to find a mate, but in the simulation, they just travel randomly in random distances.
Samantha, just out of interest, I only saw you logo, which was, but is there any particular reason for using that, or was the consideration? I was thinking like, is there any logic? Just
This was part of my coursework as well. So the net logo, like what I was introduced to through the coursework. And then as well, I think that there's a constraint on the number of licenses, or perhaps I'm mistaken.
Any final questions? That seems like we've concluded the session then. Thank you very much, Samantha.
But you're not the city. Yeah, you're not the city. Yeah, it doesn't matter.